About cyberbullying, that ought to be interesting. Maybe. There we go. Let's go ahead and get started. There we go. The original utopian vision of cyberspace, imparted by its pioneers as an egalitarian platform to connect people, to create a common bond between different cultures, creeds, and personalities, did not materialize as planned. The web, like all frontiers, has become another battlefield that often magnifies and intensifies differences and inequalities rather than cultivating empathy and understanding. Users have become overwhelmingly are concerned with the illusory rather than the real, living in imagined communities online within the architecture of specific apps first and in the real world second. In all cases, the overriding illusion users are expected to sustain is one of projected happiness, vis a vis being popular, financially successful, and in demand. There, ooh, finally, yeah. With more than 92% of teens going online daily and almost a quarter of all adolescents in the United States describing their being online almost constantly, the internet has an extraordinary effect on the psychology of our youth, including suicide. And this is Honey Boo Boo. I don't know if you remember Honey Boo Boo. She was a reality star. And any investigation into the negative effects of the internet and social media on individual and societal health and functioning is likely to cite depression as a recurring symptom among users. These symptoms are observable both online and through measurable behaviors offline, including acts of suicide, attempted suicide, and self mutilation. Addiction, cyberbullying, exposure to violent and sexual content, coercion, and influence to engage in harmful and maladaptive behaviors and different mechanisms of polarized opinion forming have all been linked to depression among susceptible individuals. According to the CDC, more than 8% are, or 2,200,000 teens between 12 and 17 in the United States reported more than 14 mentally unhappy days in the past month. Suicide is the third leading cause of death of 15 to 24-year-olds in the United States, with nearly 8% of high school students attempting suicide at least once a year. Almost twice as many have thought about it. For young people predisposed to depression, hopelessness, low self esteem, sensitivity to judgment and criticisms, and insecurities, the internet tends to magnify these qualities rather than relieve or mitigate them. Such a vulnerable person may seek escape or approval online and engage in risky online behaviors to try and accomplish such an objective. They are more likely to have a heightened sensitivity level to perceived criticism and rejection. They may lack the resilience and functional coping to deal with negative incidents effectively. Talking about feeling hopeless or aimless, talking about or displaying themes of suicide and dying, changes in behavior that maybe these are elevated risks. These are some of the things that you should be looking for in a teenager. Talking about feeling hopeless or aimless, talking about it or displaying themes of suicide and dying, changes in behavior that may be apparent online, such as changing friends or engaging in reckless behavior or commentary, and mentioning medical or health issues. Evincing some signs of personal loss or struggle with a romantic relationship, expressing uncertainty or apathy about the future, evincing a struggle with sexuality and identity, showing signs of out of character aggressiveness or agitation, displaying recurring or obsessive interest in extreme or socially unacceptable views or practices, engaging in acts of cyberbullying, for example, posting threats, flaming, demeaning comments, evincing radical changes in the frequency of internet use. The associations between internet use and suicide are complex and mostly indirect in nature and thus seldom empirically validated. Determining any linear cause and effect or causal relationship between specific computer mediated behaviors and self harm is simply not scientifically possible. Recent research highlighted the issue that the internet can encourage suicidal behavior or hinder suicide prevention. The first factor is the immense quantity of information that is available online. For anyone interested in suicide methods, thereby providing a sort of how-to guide. Another worrying aspect is the relation between cyberbullying, victimization, and suicidal behaviors through psychological stress processes. Victims of cyberbullying are almost 2 times more likely to attempt suicide than those not involved. The existence of cyber suicide pacts, usually formed online between strangers, has increased in places, whereas the anonymity of online chat rooms and virtual bulletin boards creates a disinhibition effect and becomes an unmediated platform to share views and feelings. Instigators are often mentally unstable, but able to influence or convince others who are vulnerable to follow their example. Recent occurrences of clusters of cyber suicide pacts, primarily in Japan, suggest a form of contagion that mirrors the media contagion effect found after highly publicized incidents. The immediacy and reach of social media probably add to the virulence of this phenomenon. Video sharing websites continue to grow exponentially after the creation of YouTube in 2005. The many pro-suicide and self-harm videos that are available online may normalize and reinforce self-injurious behaviors among those who are already vulnerable. These, often with explicit content, also cause emotional blunting and disinhibition of viewers, almost similar to the consumption of graphic, violent material, which contributes to lower objectivity and hesitation. The internet also facilitates the formation and functioning of extreme communities, online groups that promote beliefs and behaviors that are harmful and usually unacceptable by the social mainstream, or are unlawful, such as body modification, for example, deliberate amputation, anorexia, and genital mutilation, illegal substance use, and acts of violence. And this is an individual, this is when she was online. As you can see, she's anorexic, and this is her having recovered from anorexia. Social media creates and exacerbates documented mood disorders. 1 in 3 teens in the United States reported having been the target of cyberbullying during the transitional years to Web 2.0 and smart devices in the mid to late 2000s. While more recent figures have curiously proven elusive, the latest scholarship suggests that members of the LGBTQ++ community, in particular high school and college students aged 13 to 25, are the most overrepresented groups of victims regardless of gender identity. Social interactions such as communicating, sharing, and belonging are an integral part of mental health and well-being. When any factor, most commonly fear and shame, interferes with the desire and willingness to engage socially, a person is at risk of alienation, which is associated with a sense of low belongingness. The resulting feelings of hopelessness and worthlessness are the 2 psychological states most linked to self-harm and a desire for death. A comparatively recent 2010 study conducted with 463 public middle and high school students in Central Texas found that 84.9% of students were not involved in bullying, while 2.3% fell into the victim group, 2% into the bully group, and the remaining 10.9% were the victim-bully group. In other words, they were being victimized by bullying, and they were bullying somebody else at the same time. The results suggest that most individuals involved in bullying behaviors are both victims and perpetrators of cyberbullying and other delinquent online behaviors. There is a high correspondence between cyber and traditional perpetration and between cyber and traditional victimization. This means that youth who are involved in traditional bullying are also involved in cyberbullying. Bully victim group scored highest on all aspects, with the bully group a close second. Somewhat surprisingly, the victim group trailed significantly behind on each aspect, although still coming in higher than the non-involved group. These syndrome domains are aggressive behavior, rule breaking, social problems, thought problems, attention problems, somatic complaints, anxiety, depression, and withdrawal depression. Similarly, the bully victim group was most likely to externalize and internalize their distress, with the bullying group showing a higher tendency to internalize and be less likely to externalize than the victim online group. This outcome is also somewhat unexpected, as the automatic assumption is that the opposite that victims process their distress more internally than perpetrators, whose aberrant behaviors are often viewed as externalized reactions. Such acts include oppositional defiance, conduct disorder, antisocial personality related behavior, delinquency, violent and criminal behavior, and substance use problems. Signs of psychological distress were present at high levels for bullies and bully victims, compared to victims and non-involved subjects who scored the lowest for most measures. Bully victims were the most depressed, anxious, and stressed, and reported the lowest self-esteem. Victims showed higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress than bullies only. Bullies have a more positive health profile compared to victims, except for more problematic substance use. Although bully victims have higher levels of self-esteem and self-confidence than bullies overall, they also felt more rejected and incapable of weak, but far less so than the incapable or weak, I'm sorry, but far less so than the victim group, which indicates the core difference between the two types. Some victims are passive and loners by nature. They are emotionally imbalanced and have poor emotional regulation and social cognition. They also lack resilience, coping, and self defense skills. They are easily provoked and emotionally aroused. Many victims also engage in bullying themselves. Victims of cyberbullying also disproportionately tend to have negative thoughts about themselves and others. They are more prone to depression and anxiety. They often come from a disruptive and adverse family, school, or community environment and are noticeably rejected and isolated by peers. Self-related cognitions, peer status, and social competence are the three main predictors of being a victim of cyberbullying, with externalizing and internalizing behavior moderate predictors. Corporeal victims bullied for a physical aspect are more likely to demonstrate the internalizing of existing symptoms, engage in externalizing behavior, lack adequate social skills, possess negative self-related cognitions, experience difficulties in solving social problems, come from negative community, family, and school environments, be noticeably rejected and isolated by peers. Internalizing symptoms are a form of emotional and behavior disorder characterized by depression, withdrawal, anxiety, and loneliness, often accompanied by poor self-esteem, suicidal ideation, decreased academic and vocational performance, social isolation, and psychosomatic related physical ailments. Obsessive compulsive behaviors, trauma-related symptoms such as terrifying nightmares, flashbacks, disconnectedness, and avoidance, sleep and eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia can also be present. Externalizing symptoms commonly found among cyberbullying victims are verbal and physical aggression, substance use, smoking, suicide attempts, and self-injurious acts, including eating disorders, hyperactivity, and other conduct problems, which could include property damage. One large study among 7,182 students in grades 6 through 10 established a significant overlap between bullies and victims. Among the participants, 86.4% reported not having been involved in cyberbullying. 3.8% could be considered bullies and 5.3% victims, with the remaining 4.5% being victimized and perpetuating bullies, so-called bully victims. Social integration and status or popularity among peers are less of a determining factor, although online victims tend to feel less popular than others. Online victims are also more likely to engage in same behaviors themselves to bully others on the internet, thereby belonging to the bully victim group. Cyber victims tend to visit risky locations online, which could make victimization more likely. Extremist, pornographic, football hooligan, and activist sites and chat rooms. Age plays a role in how typical bully victims are out of their aggressions or internalize their feelings. Act out their aggressions. Older victims suffer more from depression and anxiety than the younger victims, who tend to act out as they are more likely to have undeveloped emotion regulation and impulse control skills. Effective empathy or emotional empathy is an instinctive sharing of someone else's emotions. Cyber victimization is often accompanied by a weaker ability to understand another person's perspective, both cognitively and affectively, which leads to inappropriate social responses. Distinctions between victims and bully victims. The latter group compares less favorably than both bullies and victims on most psychosocial and behavioral measures. These parameters include conduct problems, deviance, negative peer influences, depressive symptoms, lower academic performance, and negative parenting. The bully victim group is generally more temperamental and more isolated socially compared to bullies, victims, and non-involved children. They also tend to favor external attributions to help explain their experiences and have a reactive disposition, which implies impulsivity and a lack of emotional regulation. Compared to the non-bullied group, cyberbullied victims tend to be more neurotic and less agreeable, conscientious, and extroverted. Victims are predisposed to higher levels of emotional immaturity and instability, which implies an ego weakness and is characterized by lower trait emotional intelligence scores. These individuals tend to be sensitive, fretful, easily annoyed, and neurotic. They are also not detail-oriented and ignore warning signs, which is associated with spontaneous reactions, lapses in judgment, and occasional poor decision-making. Victims can be dependent and demanding of attention, but prone to isolation. They also have a higher external locus of control and are dependent on the approval of others, while being sensitive to criticism. Cyber victimization is strongly associated with lower levels of extroversion and openness, which can be explained by the greater number of online friends and tendency towards self-disclosure that could attract negative responses. It is a combination of extroversion, openness, emotionality, and conscientiousness that may contribute to a higher risk of being a cyber victim rather than the individual traits in isolation. While a person with this type of personality constellation may appear socially adept, they may not be emotionally equipped to deal with the consequences that often accompany larger and less constrained social networks. Such experiences are likely to increase feelings of depression and anxiety and inner conflicts between the need to be accepted and popular and to be organized in control and able to defend themselves. When this type of dissonance occurs, two outcomes are likely. The person will either respond by becoming more active online, possibly engaging in even riskier interactions in cyberbullying, or they withdraw into states of heightened emotional instability and possible self harm behaviors. Males are thought to be more consistently involved in reported acts of cyberbullying than females, and corporeal bullying is most prevalent in middle school and peaks during transitions from elementary to middle school and from middle to high school. Victims are also targeted because of factors that set them at a disadvantage, such as religious, cultural, and other differences. The first of the risk factors in an individual's peer group that are likely to cause bullying is homophily, or how homogeneous the social environment is. Higher within group similarities are associated with elevated levels of low level aggression, such as teasing, social exclusion, and rumor spreading. In a similar manner, delinquent peer norms encourage involvement in bullying as well as substance use, more so with bully victims than victims. Other environmental risk factors that increase the probability of bullying among youth are as follows. A school climate that is punitive and not supportive helps proliferate bullying behavior. When bullying behaviors are ignored by adults, staff, and management, its prevalence is higher. Classrooms and work groups with weak and negative relationships, where a lack of self control is tolerated and there is a deficient work and learning ethics and poor problem solving, encourage bullying to continue. Feelings of school and work belongings are associated with less victimization. In communities where intolerance, crime, violence, family discord, and abuse is present at higher levels, bullying is more likely to continue unchecked. In Sweden, researchers analyzed the MMPI-2 profiles of 85 bullying victims. The three groups identified in the study are the seriously affected, the disappointed and depressed, and the common. The whole sample showed high scores on the hypochondriasis. Hypochondriasis is where you think you're sick all the time. Depression and hysteria. Hysteria is overreacting to things as their clinical scales. Individuals with all three high scores are typically diagnosed as neurotic with hypochondriacal, anxious, and depressive features, with psychophysiological reactions and somatic complaints. They often feel despondent and hopeless, are conflicted over dependency and self assertion, and suffer from sleep disturbances. They tend to keep others at emotional distance and prefer to take few risks. The seriously affected victims, which comprised almost one-third, 32% of victims, generally had highly elevated personality profiles with the T-scores of 7 of the 10 clinical scales above 65. 4 of the scales had T-scores above 80, which are considered an extremely psychopathology. In addition to high hypochondriasis, depression, and hysteria scores, the paranoia scale was also elevated, which indicates a high level of mistrust and suspiciousness and skepticism. The second group, the disappointed and depressed victims that represented 44% of the sample, Also had a raised personality profile with the same 4 clinical scales at a T greater than 65 than in the first cluster. However, there was less elevation at each point than those of the first group, except the masculinity, femininity, and hypomania scales, which were similar across all the clusters. The third cluster, the common group, included 1/4 of the overall sample and displayed a relatively normal MMPI-2 personality profile with the 10 clinical scales at T greater than 60, which does not portray or any psychological disturbances. Apart from an anger content scale at T less than 60, it's less than. No other content scale was raised. These results pertained to victims who were bullied at work, and that 77% of the sample were women. Bullying perpetrators are prone to 3 specific transitional analyses, games. Now I've got you, you son of a bitch. Cops and robbers, hide and seek. See what you made me do. Now I've got you, you son of a bitch. Bullies tend to operate from a free child and somewhat less prevalent from a critical parent state. Common objectives are to persecute the victim for an assumed wrongdoing or to gain ego strokes by satisfying the child's need for excitement. Byrne identified a stroke as the fundamental unit of social action, or in other words, a physical, verbal, or nonverbal act of recognition. Interaction from an adapted child to a parent ego state, with the victim confirming his or her existential position of, I'm not okay, you're okay. Here, the victim likely experiences and projects familiar feelings of shame and self pity, which can attract a wide cross section of predatory and bullying types. Wooden leg, acting sensitive and dependent, lacking the necessary resources to resolve issues, invariably assuming a victim role. Victims do not believe that they are able to change the situation. As a result, they are prone to apathy or anxiety and accept being bullied as their fate. This then becomes justification for their lack of competence or motivation to take responsibility and action. As before, their payoff seems to be confirmation of the existential life position, you're okay, I'm not okay. Poor me, this type of victim feels and acts helpless and is prone to excessive worry and other symptoms of depression, including sleep disturbances and psychosomatic complaints. Victims hold the same existential position of you're okay, I'm not okay, but they are less needy and dependent and more likely to be withdrawn or isolated to or isolate themselves with a defeatist woe is me worldview. If it weren't for you, this role is typical of bully victims who are insecure or passive and instinctively choose a dominant partner to control and restrict their activities. They don't like to take risks and instead use their dysfunctional relationship to blame the partner for issues that they could certainly control or change. Should they be willing to face their fears and shortcomings? Stupid, the bullying victim functions from a depressive position, perpetuating feelings of inferiority and helplessness. He or she has a poor self-image and compares him or herself negatively to others. The subconscious drive is for the victim to make the perpetrator call him or her stupid or act accordingly. Thereby, the victim relieves the pressure by feeling that everyone is satisfied with him or her as long as he or she is stupid, which relates to sustaining low expectations. Why don't you? Yes, but. The oldest subject of game analysis and the transactional game most commonly played, YDYB, aims to reassure and gratify the child. Here, the bullying victim needs reassurance but avoids surrender or disengagement by continuing to draw the perpetrator in. In a sense, by allowing themselves to remain the victim, they get the recognition that they desire. While transactional games mentioned imply that the victims are complicit in the exchanges and maintenance, one must remember that it applies to victims who are either unable or unwilling to escape the victim role and disengage from the dysfunctional interaction. There being a power imbalance between the perpetrator and victim, even online, the transactions between participants define their roles as perpetrators, victims, or bully victims and define their likelihood to sustain that position repeatedly and over time. Victims operate from a position of weakness, often created by a depressive or neurotic disposition characterized by low self esteem and either withdrawal, isolation, or sacrifice as a preferred coping mechanism. The same basic process applies to cyberspace. After the bully and victim engage, the latter is compelled by their needs and fears to maintain their engagement, thereby confirming their life script, whether it is in their perceived lack of self worth or the deservedly low expectations of others. Basically, if they are not resilient and capable of accepting responsibility to act and believe that positive change is possible, they become hooked by the bully with a paralysis that prevents defensive actions. Victims are prone to be bullied, both offline and online, because their negative views about themselves and their position in the world and lack of hope for the future. Their instinctive coping mechanisms therefore determine how they are most likely to respond and what the probable outcomes are. An internalizing style is associated with a learned helplessness steeped in depression and anxiety, which leads to withdrawal, isolation, and self-injurious behavior as typical responses. Externalizing behaviors are characterized by a passive reaction style where the victim turns to becoming a perpetrator themselves. He or she acts aggressively as a means of defense, but also from a position of problematic self-related cognitions, high susceptibility, and deficient social competence. The typical bully victim can also end in a physical violence between others or themselves. The use of online chat rooms and virtual bulletin boards and forums can provide an unmediated avenue to share one's feelings with other like minded individuals, which can be easier than talking about such thoughts and feelings in person. This can lead to something negative, such as cyber mobbing, cyber suicide pacts, virtual contagion, and harmful knowledge. Or it can be constructed in the sense of group support, awareness, education, and crisis management. Because of its convoluted and confounding nature, cyberbullying is not an easy endeavor, as the anonymity and lack of oversight associated with social interactions online complicate many strategies. Preventive and preventative and intervention efforts have to be addressed by the individual. Community, institutional, and policy level systematic approaches aimed at potential perpetrators and victims. Social skills training and cognitive therapy can assist at risk and affected individuals and their families to manage the psychological effects of cyberbullying and change stereotype perceptions, while education in online etiquette and safe practices can improve confidence and provide alternative solutions to desist or respond to harmful online behaviors. Parental training can also help develop more positive parent child relationships earlier. The problem of cyberbullying is best tackled from multiple angles. Teaching youth ways of technically protecting themselves from harassment online. This is primarily achieved by blocking messages and identities, keeping information private, being selective of contacts, and reporting abuse to website administrators. Telling an adult, such as a teacher or parent, is the least used option, especially among older youth and boys, but encouragement, awareness, and sensitivity can help make these avenues more viable. Practical school-based anti-bullying programs have had reasonable success rates. These typically include a well-implemented policy and awareness raising and curriculum-based activities such as computer-based classroom exercises. Another option is mentorship type support for victims from high status peers and empathy training for perpetrators. Bullying, including cyberbullying, is as much a behavior management issue in the educational setting as it is related to individual and family factors. By developing a safe and respectful environment, bullying behaviors are reduced and prevented. The following 9 consequential steps are proposed for responding to cyberbullying. Save the evidence. Print copies of messages and websites. For a first offense, if minor in nature, ignore, delete, or block the sender. Reporting if a face or offensive profile targeting your child is set up on a social network site, report it to the site host. Investigate and monitor your child's online presence. Communicate if the perpetrator is another student. Share evidence with the school board. If the perpetrator is known cyberbully, continue in contact with the child's parents and share your evidence. Legal advice if the parent of the perpetrator is unresponsive and the behavior continues, contact an attorney or seek legal advice. Law enforcement report the cyberbullying to the police. Even if no further action is taken, a record of the incident will enable future follow-up or legal disciplinary action. Mental health support if your child expresses emotional distress or thoughts of self-harm. Seek help from a school counselor or other mental health professionals immediately. The fact that cyberbullying happens to at least 1 in 4 adolescents and the vast majority of victims and bystanders do not report their incidents to adults necessitates an increased focus on prevention and awareness efforts. And that is the end of the chapter. Oh no, I'm still on.